Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. Hello, we're going to get started in just a couple minutes. While we're waiting, if you want to say hello in the chat box, let us know where you're joining us from. Okay, let's see. We have lots of folks joining us. DC, Georgia, New York, Hawaii.
I saw quite a few from Arizona.
Yeah.
Coming in strong.
Rhode Island.
All right. Greatest little state in the union.
The Mitten State, that's my home state, Michigan. California or Arizona. Yep, lots from Arizona. Maine. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. All right, thanks everybody. Continue saying hello in the chat box. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. All attendees are in listen-only mode. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and the slides will be made available to you. Hello again, my name is Leslie Gabay-Swanston. I'm the Director of Program and Systems Quality at the National Summer Learning Association. Welcome to our webinar, Creating Healing-Centered Summer Programs. As we're going along, if you have any questions for our presenter, please try to put those into the Q&A box. We'll try to catch them if they're in the chat box, but it's a little bit easier for us to keep track of them and see them and ask them live if you put them into the Q&A box. So before we get started, for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, the National Summer Learning Association is the only national nonprofit exclusively focused on addressing the achievement and opportunity gaps by increasing access to summer learning opportunities. NSLA's goal is to increase nationwide the number of high-quality summer learning programs. To achieve this goal, NSLA recognizes and disseminates what works, offers expertise and support for programs and communities, and advocates for summer learning as a solution for equity and excellence in education. NSLA's work is driven by the belief that all children and youth deserve high-quality summer learning experiences that will help them succeed at college and career and life. Core to our work is the recognition that high-quality summer learning programs work and have been shown to improve reading and math skills, school attachment, motivation, and relationships with adults and peers. So what do we mean when we say summer learning? This slide just quickly gives some broad distinctions between summer school, traditional summer school, and summer learning. So typically when we think of summer school, we think of remedial education. We think of it being academic focused. It's usually school-based in a school building, or it's district-based, school district-based. Many feel of it and think of it as being punitive, as a punishment for not doing as well during the school year. It may be mandatory for some students. It's very adult driven and focused, and generally feels like traditional school day. When we think of summer learning, we think of it as being kind of opposite from what a traditional summer school looks like. When we want it to focus on new and accelerated learning, we want it to have project-based hands-on learning as well. It can take place in a variety of settings and locations. It could be a library, it could be a museum, it could be a community-based organization, or really any organization in the community. We like to encourage folks to plan exciting, engaging, and attractive programs that students will want to attend. It should be voluntary and open to all. And we also encourage programs to put a strong emphasis on student voice, choice, and identity. And we always want summer learning programs to have a unique site climate and culture with more of a camp-like feel. So that's what we think of at NSLA when we think of summer learning. So I wanted to introduce our guest next, Megan Bartlett, who's going to talk to us about healing-focused summer programs. Megan?
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the work of NSLA, and in particular you, for making sure that this all happened, making the process of doing all this so seamless and smooth. Hey, everybody, my name's Megan. I work for WeCoach, and I'm really excited to be here to share a little bit about how we can create healing-centered environments for young people. I am hoping you can all see my screen. Leslie, let me know if you can't see it. I'm used to doing more Zoom meetings than Zoom webinars. So if I do something that is sort of not the way to go with a webinar, just interrupt me and make me fix it. So I also actually, what I think of as upgraded the title of this to Activating Healing-Centered Environments. We're going to talk a little bit about being active and the important role that movement has in supporting young people who've been affected by overwhelming stress or trauma. And so I want to be sure that we think about this as actively as we can. I'm used to talking to coaches, so you may hear a few sport references as I go, but it is absolutely not meant to suggest that you have to do full-on sport. It's really about how do we get young people moving in very specific ways that I'll talk about, in addition to a bunch of other things that were other ways that we're supporting them. So we're going to think about how do we activate some healing-centered environments this summer. And I am going to, I can't do, it wouldn't be sort of right to talk about activating healing-centered environments without doing a little something active to start. And I recognize that I am the only one on screen, and that's totally okay. Because even if you were all here with me in a meeting, it would be totally your choice to participate in this or not. But if you're like me and you've been sitting around at a computer, hunched over a computer screen for, well, a year, it feels good to move a little bit before we start, but it also is incredibly important in terms of the learning. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about why in a minute. But I'm going to ask you to participate with me in this in a very short activity that you can do seated, you can do standing, sort of however you're comfortable doing. But I'm going to feel your vibes out there that you're doing it with me, particularly you, that big group from Arizona. I'm definitely counting on you all. So what's going to happen is you're going to see 4 pictures of 4 female athletes show up on your screen. And all you have to do is sort of mimic their pose. And we're going to sort of string them together almost like a yoga flow. There's always some real yogis on the call that say this is nothing like a yoga flow, Megan, but, and I recognize that. Let's call it sort of a yoga adjacent activity. All right, so here we go. We're going to go ahead and get started. The first one is, if you don't know, this is Megan Rapinoe. And to do the Megan Rapinoe, you hold your arms out like this, as though you've just scored a goal in the World Cup, Women's World Cup in 2019. If you know anything about the power pose research that a researcher named Amy Cuddy does up here in Boston, you know that if you hold a powerful open pose like this for at least 30 seconds, you go into whatever you're doing next with more confidence. And I think Megan Rapinoe is the ultimate power pose, but it also just feels so good to get those shoulders back and those arms out. All right, you can shake out that Megan. The next one you're going to see on the screen here is the Queen, Miss Serena Williams. You're going to get your tennis ball throwing arm out, your tennis racket back, and again, get those shoulders nice and open as though you're ready to put this serve down somebody's throat. And we go from the Serena into the Megan, and we can shake that out. Great. The next one is the Ibtihaj Muhammad. Ibtihaj Muhammad was an Olympic fencer, first American woman to compete in the Olympics wearing a hijab. You get your nice epee arm out like this. If you're standing, you can get a nice little lunge, your arm back. And if you're seated, you can just sort of turn and reach out into the Ibtihaj. And from the Ibtihaj, we'll go into the Serena. From the Serena into the Megan. All right, and you can shake that out. For the last one, we're going to do the Simone. But if this move feels a little intimidating, you can go ahead and do this one instead. You're going to get a nice little lunge in. And the most important part of this, even if you're seated, is to get those good gymnast fingers out in front. Those good gymnast fingers for the Simone. And we go from the Simone to the Ibtihaj, Ibtihaj to the Serena, and Serena to the Megan. All right, you can go ahead and shake that out. I trust and appreciate how many of you participated with me while we were doing that. And it's not just to make my body feel, my old aging body feel better, which it does make my old aging body feel better. But it's also really important for us from a learning perspective, right? We're at our computers so much these days, it's important to move. And I wanna make sure that we talk today, and you're gonna hear as we go, why movement is so important. I also felt, and I'm seeing in the chat now, that quite a few of you also did this with me, so thank you. The other reason we do it is because it's also a great practice to start with a moment of connection. And somebody just noted, and all women, and I'm going to talk about that in a second too, but we're going to hear a lot today about the power of physical activity and the power of connection as ways that help young people heal. And sometimes when I talk about that, it feels really straightforward, really easy, but I want to explore a little bit why that's true so we can use those strategies even more intentionally as we go. And as somebody noted in the chat, these are all women, and 3 of them are Black women. And that is incredible. One is an out gay athlete, and that is an incredibly intentional move, because one of the other things we're going to talk about today is what kind of stress affects young people. And when we think about trauma, we often think about these sort of big events, right? Obviously, we're living through a global pandemic. That's a big event. But we also think about school shootings or earthquakes or other sort of natural disasters as traumatic. But what we know is that as traumatic is something that sometimes people call little t trauma, which is the experience of being othered, the experience of being a minority in a majority culture. And so in sport, where I do my work, women are inherently othered. Sport was created by men for men. And so thinking about the ways in which our environments are as safe as possible, are as inclusive as possible, and are as making and being really intentional to make sure that they are not being harmful is sort of a prerequisite to making sure that they're healing. And so in general, we know that marginalized groups, people whose communities have been intentionally divested from, have those othering experiences. And so we're going to talk about sort of what that does to a young person and their response to stress. So we're going to talk about physical activity and connection as ways of healing. And we're going to talk about all kinds of ways that young people can be sort of dysregulated by stress, can develop a sensitized stress response. So, all right. So I'm going to start with, and I assume if you're here that you have sort of a general sense or have heard a little bit about what we mean when we say trauma. But I want to make sure that we're at least working from a common definition for it, because there is no real common definition for trauma, and we can be talking about a lot of things. I want to make sure that we're as sort of comprehensive as we can be about what we mean when we say that. So the way I like to think about it is that it has to do with the experiences that young people are bringing with them to, in this case, summer learning, to whatever environment you're giving them those opportunities. And the weight that they're carrying from those experiences is different depending on what those experiences have been. So experience shapes the architecture of our brain, and so the experiences really matter. And we can assume that any young person showing up to summer learning has a chance to have been exposed to something traumatic, right? And we learned that really in particular through something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study was done in the 90s, and it showed us three things. One, that a list of 10 adverse experiences, which included physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, a caregiver with a major substance abuse issue or mental health issue, an incarcerated relative, a mother treated violently, or the experience of going through a divorce as a young person, right? Your parents were getting divorced. That those 10 things that can be particularly stressful for young people happen more often than we think they do. In fact, some estimates have as many as about 60% of the population have had one, and somewhere close to about 25% of the population have had three or more of those experiences happen. And we also learned that while they happen more often than we thought, they also tend to cluster. If you've had one, you're more likely to have multiple. And that by having them, we're at a higher risk for long-term negative health outcomes, right? The experience of those adverse experiences isn't good for our bodies or our brains. And so we know that these happen more often than we think. We also know that they happen across communities. They happen in every race, they happen in every ethnicity, they happen across socioeconomic status. They have the chance that they could happen to you is real in any population of young people. So no matter who you're working with, the chance that some of them are showing up having had an adverse childhood experience is pretty high, right? And they might be carrying the weight of that adverse childhood experience. And now, after a year of a global pandemic, after COVID-19, the chance that young people are showing up with more weight than they've had in the past is also higher, right? So everyone has experienced this pandemic in some way or another, and certainly in different ways. And we'll talk a little bit about the disproportionate impact. But the chance that young people in your group have had more significant stress because of the global pandemic obviously goes up. Yes, I can repeat them. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect. That's the first 5. The next 2 are caregiver substance abuse or mental health issues. That's 7. 8 is the experience of divorce. 9 is having an incarcerated relative. And 10 is having a mother treated violently, so domestic abuse in the home. All right. Yes, and we're going to talk about how it's compounded by racial inequities and historic discrimination against people of color. That's exactly the preview for where we're going. So now that COVID-19 we've lived through this for the last year, the chance that someone in your group is showing up with more stress just goes up. right? So more young people, the likelihood that they're experiencing more overwhelming stress goes up. Then when we start to talk about students from historically exploited communities, right, or communities that have been intentionally divested from, who might be impacted by adverse childhood experiences and are disproportionately impacted by other kinds of trauma that happen in the community. So think about things that are more likely to happen in communities with fewer resources, like community violence, homelessness, food insecurity, immigration status that puts you at risk, the impacts of a public health crisis, which are disproportionately impacted by or felt by low-income communities, and the experience of oppression, right? So students from historically exploited communities who are going to be impacted by adverse childhood experiences, some of them may be disproportionately impacted by this community trauma, are disproportionately impacted by the experience of COVID-19, both the actual illness and the implications of the global pandemic, right? So implications like job insecurity, economic hardship, and having also knowing that oppressed communities are more likely to actually suffer from the illness. The young people that are coming from those communities are more likely to be carrying more weight. And finally, when we're talking about Black students who have the chance to be impacted by adverse childhood experiences, are disproportionately impacted by community trauma, disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, both the actual illness and the implications of the global pandemic, plus 400 years of oppression, including brutal enslavement, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and state violence, are now watching Black people murdered, often with no repercussion. The chance that they're showing up carrying more weight is also higher. Now, of course, none of this is a guarantee, right? None of this means that every young person that shows up is going to have had these experiences. It points to trends that are important to understand, that some young people are more likely to have had overwhelming stress than others. And actually, any young person who shows up to us, the chance that they've experienced overwhelming stress is probably higher than we think. And so why does this matter? Because trauma changes our brain. And in order to understand how it changes the brain, you have to first have a general sense of the structure of the brain, which develops from the back to the front, both evolutionarily, so more simple animals to more complex animals and humans, and chronologically. So from sort of a developing fetus all the way through their lifespan, with the most rapid growth happening in the first few years of life, right? But in all cases, it develops more simple function in the back to more complex function in the front. So we started from the bottom, and now we're here. The bottom of the brain, our brainstem, is in charge of your basic functions, all the things you don't have to think about. The middle of your brain, where you interact with the world, it's where you respond to your surroundings and experience emotions. And the front top part of your brain, which is the uniquely human part of your brain, is your smart brain, the part of your brain that deals with complex and rational thinking, the cortex. Trauma impacts all of the brain, but the sort of places where it's centralized are sort of in the back middle of the brain, where our stress response lives. Our stress response is how we react when we experience stress. Its job is to keep us safe. It detects threat and helps us protect ourselves from that threat. I think of it as a little periscope on a submarine. So it's constantly scanning the environment, being like, are you a threat? Are you a threat? Are you a threat? Are you a threat? And looking for threat and trying to keep us safe. And when we experience stress, our stress response tells us we're in danger and tries to keep us safe. It activates a set of responses, right? Some that start with F that you might have heard of are fight, flight, or freeze reactions. So for example, if we're being chased by a bear, we either fight the bear, run from the bear, or play dead. We also might dissociate, which is another kind of response to stress. The process of disconnecting yourself from the experience you're going through, because you know your body is preparing for the pain. You know there's no way to escape it. So our fight, flight, and freeze responses, or our dissociative responses, are what happen when we're threatened, when we're under stress, when the stress we experience is overwhelming. And the problem with trauma, or that overwhelming stress, is that it short circuits our normal stress response, right? Because we're either in danger so often, or the danger we're in is so extreme that it makes our stress response overactive or hypersensitive. And now, because we've experienced so much stress, our stress response starts to try and protect us all the time, even when we only experience a little bit of stress. And that's because the brain is like a muscle. It's not actually a muscle, but it functions like one, in that it's plastic and use dependent. When I say plastic, I mean that it can always change. It turns out that you actually can teach an old dog new tricks, right? So you can always change your brain. And it's also use dependent. The parts that you use the most become the strongest. Just like if you're trying to build up your shoulder strength, if you use those muscles as much as you can, they'll get stronger. Your brain is like that too. And so that means that when we have a lot of overwhelming stress, we use our stress response a lot. Seems obvious, right? But when we use it a lot, it becomes strong. So strong that even small amounts of stress now set it off, right? Now, even small amounts of stress, our stress response is so ready for any stress. It is so overworked that even just a little bit of stress sets it off. And that means we react to things in disproportionate ways. We react to small things like they're big things. And the other thing that happens when the stress response gets stronger is that it starts to overrule other parts of the brain. It says, rational thinking and decision making, we don't have time for you. We're just going to react and protect ourselves. We're actually going to restrict access to the cortex. We don't need that rational thinking. We're going to shut it down. And we've often seen or been, even if we don't know it at the time, this kind of behavior that happens when this happens, right? We overreacted or weren't at our best when we started to get amped up on stress. Let's take a minute and look at why. Everything about your brain, the way it was developed, the way it takes in information, the way all brain systems are organized, happen from the bottom to the top. The higher and smarter parts of the brain rely on the lower and more reactive parts of the brain to function the way they're supposed to in order to use these higher parts of the brain. You can't actually think rationally with this part of the brain if you're overwhelmed by something in your surroundings, right? You can't do calculus if you're standing in the middle of the freeway. I can't do calculus anyway, but generally the idea is that you can't do calculus when you're standing in the middle of the freeway because all of your energy is used to pay attention to the cars and keep yourself safe, right? And that's good. Your body should do that. You don't want to actually be worried about calculus when you're standing in the middle of the freeway. It closes down access to the cortex. So if you experience trauma and that reactive brain takes over, if you start to have those stressed out responses, even when it's not that stressful, that's the bottom of the brain taking over. And we call it dysregulation. And in order to get better, you have to get that part of the brain in order. So in order to be able to use our brain in the way that we want, in order to be able to have conversations with young people where they can think rationally, they can make good decisions, they can learn cognitive content, we first have to regulate. We have to calm our stress response down. We have to be able to bring our stress levels back to baseline instead of having them constantly elevated. Then the next thing we have to do is relate. We have to calm our stress response down. And one of the best ways to do that is to feel safe and connected. The middle part of our brain is attuned to other people in the world around us. We have to connect in order to get this part of the brain working the way it should so that we can get to the top part of the brain. I once heard someone call relationships the superhighway to learning, and that's a great way to think about what's going on in that part of your brain, is that when that part of your brain feels safe and connected, we can totally sort of take the HOV lane to learning. And if we do those two things, if we get regulated and connected, then we can be reasonable, right? Then we can learn. Then we can store that cognitive content that we want, right? So when we talk about learning loss from this year, for example, and wanting to make some of that up over the summer, it is absolutely essential to being able to learn that, to being able to learn at all, for young people to be regulated and connected. If they're not, if we go right into reasoning before regulation and relation, then we are being biologically disrespectful of what their brains need. And so we want to make sure that we're focused on how do we give young people the opportunity to regulate, and how do we make sure that they get and stay connected. And in order to stop having any behavioral challenges that might come from our overreactive stress response, we also need to regulate and relate so that we can start using more cognitive-based strategies, right? We need to get at the bottom of our brain and work our way up to the cortex. So, all right. So if we're doing that, if we're focusing on regulating, relating, and reasoning, which is actually the 3 R's come to us from a guy named Bruce Perry, who is a neuroscientist and child psychiatrist who we are lucky to work with, who has a new book out with Oprah. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it if you're working with, well, any people, young people in particular. But thinking about what's involved in the brain when we understand the experiences that young people have gone through. And so that's sort of all the bad news, right? Is that trauma, the experience of trauma, happens more often than we think, and it can sort of mess with our brains. But the good news, and this is what I love about the brain, is that actually in the same way that the brain can get messed up by the experience of overwhelming stress, the opposite is also true. The brain can heal. The brain can always get better. And we know what some of the things are that help us make sure that it does. And summer learning experiences in their most traditional forms have these things baked in. And once we understand sort of why they're so powerful, we can be even more intentional about them. And the first is the experience of relationships, right? So trust is the antidote to stress. So if you have a young person who has trusted adults in their experience, trusted peers in their experience, the chance that they're going to be able to feel safe and connected and be able to engage in the experience in the way that we want them to goes up, right? Because that trust that these people care about me, I feel seen and heard, I know what to expect from these people, creates safety around a young person that allows them to sort of calm down that stress response. And overwhelmingly, the research supports the idea that relationships are the most important part of supporting young people who've been exposed to trauma. And I want to talk a little bit before we move on to what else is involved with our summer learning experiences to help young people heal. I want to talk a little bit about something that I think is a really important thing to consider when you're considering what kinds of interactions are really helpful for young people who've experienced trauma. We have this idea that sort of 50 minutes a week therapy sessions are how you heal. And while there are incredible things that happen in 50-minute therapy sessions, what we know about the brain is that the brain, in addition to maybe, or even in place of in some cases, what the brain really needs from a stress perspective, from a coping with stress perspective, from a chemical perspective, when we talk about the impact of stress, is it needs shorter, more bursts of positive connection. It needs as many high fives, as many positive eye contact, if that's appropriate for the culture. It needs as many of those positive relational interactions as possible. Let me tell you a little bit about why, right? And also what I hope will help you understand how powerful even a person who doesn't spend a huge amount of time with young people can be in that person's life. And basically, it comes down to the idea that our brain responds to novelty. So whenever something new happens, we have a response. Let me give you an example, either as like a camp counselor or a coach, right? You're sort of coaching a group of young people for the first time. The first time you meet them, their stress response goes off. They're like, hey, can I trust this person? Who is this? Is this somebody who's going to hurt me or help me? Right? And that's good and protective. They need to be on alert to see if they can trust you. And when that happens, they get a blast of stress chemicals, right? They see you, they're like, oh, I don't know. Let's go, brain, get ready just in case, right? And those stress chemicals go off. They get that blast. Then the more they see you, the more they begin to trust you, and your face becomes known, that instead of getting the blast of stress chemicals, they actually get a blast of protective chemicals, which calm the stress response down. And you only need a brief interaction to get the blast, right? And because you've now gone from somebody who is unknown to somebody who's known and trusted. But our brain still responds to novelty. So the first time they see you after a while, they're like, oh, hey, look, there's Megan. There's my coach. I like her. Let me get that burst of protective chemicals. And you only need a brief interaction to get that blast. So longer interactions with kids are not necessarily better from a stress management perspective. Longer interactions are going to be obviously essential to, say, learning a new skill, learning a new concept in math. But when it comes to managing stress, all you need are these short bursts, and they start to add up. Because the brain works like a piano and not like an organ, right? So if you think about the difference between a piano and an organ, when you go to press the key, if you hold your finger there on an organ, the sound will continue. But with a piano, no matter how long you hold the key, you just get one sound. And the same is true with the brain. It records your face or those positive chemicals just the one time. So, because that's when it's novel, right? So extra time doesn't actually have to mean better. And that means that at times like this, when we're likely to have more stress chemicals in our system, even small connections matter. And they matter a lot. It doesn't take a lot to give a young person a burst of protection against those chemicals. They're also cumulative, right? So in the same way that if you have a lot of ongoing overwhelming stress, that can sort of rewire and mess with your brain, the same is true for healing. So all of those small positive interactions also add up when it comes to our brains functioning the way we want them to, our ability to manage stress in a protective but also productive way. So trusting relationships are the absolute highest priority to any environment in which young people have experienced overwhelming stress. The second thing about these environments is that they're healing because they're active. Physical activity is good for the brain, right? It primes the brain for learning, helps us engage the higher parts or the smarter parts of the brain. And that's true because physical activity is reliant on or built on the idea of patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity. Patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity is how we learn. Patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity regulates the stress response and opens up our brain for learning. And patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity does that because it mimics the sound of the heartbeat. And so when we were in our mother's womb and all of our needs were being met, our brain made an association between the heartbeat and having all of our needs being met, being safe and cared for. And so anytime we engage in something that mimics that beat, that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity, we get regulated, right? And you probably understand this, that if you work out before you go to work, you have a better day. If you're feeling really crappy and you go for a nice long walk, that can help us feel better, help us get more regulated. That patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity, which is all over camp experiences or sport experiences, or can be better, even better integrated into whatever youth serving experience we have, is positive. And it could be walking, running, swimming, jumping rope, anything that engages in that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity, because it helps us feel safe. It helps us sort of trick our brain into thinking that we're safe and regulated. And then the other thing that youth serving environments can do is create manageable patterns of stress. The opposite of overwhelming stress is not no stress, right? It's dosed stress, right? So as much as we'd like to wrap everybody up in bubble wrap and hope that nothing bad ever happens to them again, the opposite, that actually won't help them heal, because the opposite of this overwhelming experience of stress is not to have no stress, it's to have dosed pieces of stress, right? Which is like adding 5 pounds to the bench press at a time instead of 50. Or adding speed and picking up your head as you learn to dribble, not expecting someone to dribble with their non-dominant hand at full speed down the court with their head up and take on a defender, right? We add the challenge as we go. Anybody who teaches young people skills understands that we have to sort of scaffold that stress in a way that is manageable. Because stress that is controlled, moderate, and predictable builds resilience. Stress that's severe, prolonged, or chaotic is what creates vulnerability. Stress that's severe, unpredictable, or prolonged creates vulnerability. That's the experience of overwhelming stress. That's the experience of trauma. But if we engage in stress that is controlled, moderate, and predictable, that's how you build resilience. And I want to say 2 things about that before we move on. One is that I think there's a little bit of a misperception about resilience, and there's an idea that you can learn resilience. You can't. Resilience is experienced. It's the experience of having your stress levels elevate, go back to baseline, elevate a little bit more, and still be able to go all the way back to down to baseline before they get elevated again. Right? That's resilience, weathering the stress. So every time we engage in a new skill and we can calm ourselves all the way back down before we experience another sort of dose of new stress, that allows us to build the patterns of resilience. And then, so that's one thing about resilience that I want to be sure to say. The second thing that I want to be sure to say is that helping kids build resilience is obviously something that you can see would be valuable for any young person, right? The ability to still operate when you're experiencing some stress, to be able to experience stress and then come back down to a baseline is an incredible skill, right? It's an incredibly important thing for all young people, all people to have. You can also see why it would be even more important for a young person who has a lot of stress in their lives to build the skill of resilience. But helping kids build resilience does not mean that we don't have to address the systems that cause the stress in the first place. So let me say that again. Helping kids be resilient to stress doesn't get us out of dismantling the oppressive systems causing the stress in the first place. And if we're not sort of aware of, conscious of, and active in that, then we've undermined the first thing that I talked about, that important, that really important piece of helping kids heal, that trust, right? If we aren't engaged in dismantling the oppressive systems that are causing the stress in the first place, then it's incredibly hard for us to build the trusting relationships that we need in order to help kids heal. So I see some things happening in the chat. Yep. All right, great. Yes. We can't use resilience as an excuse not to also make sure there's less stress in young people's lives. And we know that that's coming from both individual circumstances, but also oppressive systems. All right. So if we know that we can do these things, right? If we know that our environments or the best environments for young people to heal have these 3 things in them, what do we do? How do we use them? What do we do for the summer in particular, particularly this summer after what everybody's been through? Although these will work in every in every circumstance. The thing about trauma-informed care or healing-centered environments or work with young people who've been exposed to trauma is that it works for all kids. And it works for all kids, but it's essential for the kids who need it. Those kids won't make it if we don't do it. All right, so what do? I'm going to share a couple of strategies. You don't have to frantically write them down if you don't want to. I have a little worksheet that I'll send out, or that I'll ask Leslie to post, so people can get that. And I'll also share the deck if people want it. And as Leslie said, we're being recorded. So don't feel like you have to frantically write unless you're a frantic writer, and that helps you remember things. If that is true, do you? So first, I want us to, knowing what we know, I want us to think about the idea of transitions. Transitions are going to be a huge opportunity to add value for young people who've experienced overwhelming stress. And I'm going to ask us to think about that in a couple of different ways, right? So transitions into programs, transitions during programs, but sort of thinking about a couple of things when we're thinking about transitions. The first is, what's your space like, right? Being consistent in how you set a space up so young people know what to do and where to go, right? Thinking about securing valuables, even if it doesn't seem valuable to you, it likely is to a young person, minimizing distraction, maximizing privacy, and providing comfortable places for young people to be, right? Offering options for young people to set their own transition pace. Right? I worked with a great youth worker who, when young people would come into their space, they all sort of engaged in some informal time. And what she would do is 10 minutes before they were getting ready to start, she would blow her whistle or make a sort of clapping noise. She had a little clapper thing, and she'd do it 3 times. And then when there were 5 minutes before they were going to get started, she'd do it twice. And then when there were 2 minutes before she'd get started, she'd do it once. So everybody knew that as that countdown went down, they knew how much time before they were getting ready to move into the next thing. Or if you've ever worked or seen somebody doing sort of physical therapy or personal training, they often count your reps for you. That's to create predictability, right? Because predictability can be so powerful for young people, for all people, right? Knowing what to expect is how we're safe, right? So thinking about, how do we make sure that young people know what to expect in the space that they're in? Thinking about our first interactions with young people, right? Remember that novelty, they get that burst of protective chemicals. So greeting each young person using names, high fives, engaging in light inquiries and check-ins, whatever feels comfortable to those young people. And then trying to facilitate some connection between young people by offering activities that encourage proximity and provide opportunities to talk, right? Nothing formal, but the option to opt into something like that if it's helpful for a young person. And then thinking about rituals, and I know Leslie mentioned this at the beginning, right? Providing options for young people to choose how they become active in the space, choose how they become sort of present in the space. Regular updates about time remaining, like I mentioned, and maybe even having a consistent opening statement that sets the tone for the day, right? That's how a young person can get acclimated and feel like, oh, this is what we do every day. Now I know what's coming next. So thinking about that predictability is such an important part of how do we help young people transition into, transition through, and then even transition out of their experiences with us, because that unpredictability is often an evocative cue for a young person's stress response. When you don't know what to expect, that's when we go into survival mode. That's when our little periscope starts to say, I don't know, are you a threat? Are you a threat? Are you a threat? Second one, I want us to think about choice and control, right? We often talk about choice and voice, and those are incredibly important parts of any young person's experience. But I'm sort of being even more explicit and intentional about the idea of giving young people some control over their experience, right? And one of the strategies that I love for this, while it sometimes seems really straightforward, is actually can be a big shift for youth workers, And that's the idea of asking more questions. Instead of spending your day directing traffic, which I know is part of the gig when you're working with a lot of young people, particularly in summer, how can we change the dynamic so we're asking more questions of young people, and not just questions of young people about their experience, about who they are, about their lives, which we should absolutely do, definitely those, but also asking questions about whatever activity you're engaged in, however, whatever skill building you're doing. How do we sort of engage them in a different way by giving them some control over their experience? Because if we ask more questions, it helps make sure that young people feel seen and heard, that their opinion and contribution to camp or summer or whatever team they're part of actually matters. Right? It helps young people think about what they're doing, right? It helps them get more engaged in getting better at something, right? If you ask a young person a question, instead of just telling them what to do and they have to respond to it, they're more likely to take it in and process it and get it all the way up to the thinking part of their brain, instead of just having it sort of filter in and filter out. Questions also make the learning more real. Again, it gets us up to this cognitive part of our brain, right? If a young person is part of the discovery process, they're much more likely to remember what they learned than if you just tell them what to do. I think of this as the difference between choosing to play the guitar and being forced to learn to play the piano, right? The people who choose to play the guitar are more likely to hold on to that information, to be more motivated to keep going with it. So how do we give young people the opportunity to have some choice over their experience, have some control over what their day and week and summer look like? Questions also help young people and us, right? Which is important because it takes more effort on our side to spend more time using the part of the brain that's involved in learning and away from the part of the brain that's in survival mode. Right? They have more control and feel safer. And if trauma is the wrenching away of control when you need it the most, then one of the most effective ways to heal is to be in control. And so all of these things, the value of asking questions to make kids feel seen and heard, engage them in their learning, and get them using their smart part of their brain, will actually contribute to their experience of choice and control, the experience of feeling safer and more able to engage in what you're doing. And for a lot of young people, part of the problem of the school year is that they don't have a lot of choice and control. They spend a lot of time being told what to do, right? And so how do we sort of flip that and encourage young people, encourage our adults to give young people more choice and control? Next, I want us to think about how we set goals with young people, right? One of the things that I run into a lot when I'm talking about the impact of overwhelming stress or trauma and the need for young people to experience love in those cases is that people think that love and high expectations are mutually exclusive, when of course they aren't. Right? So in order to push young people, we still want to do that. We want to set goals. We want them to engage in skill building. We want them to develop the efficacy that comes along with skill building, right? We want to make sure that they have some goals and can work towards them. Remembering that for young people who've been exposed to trauma, often the pathway to setting those goals is different, not the idea that they can't achieve them. Of course they can. But when we're pushing them, when we're looking at how do we dose the stress for them, how do we scaffold skills for them, we want to think about how we both dose that and also offer some control, right? It's just the process of getting to the goal. Those goals might look a little different for young people who are sensitive to stress, right? Because when we build skills, we go right outside of our comfort zone, right? In order to get better at something, we have to push a little bit beyond where we're comfortable. And that's the experience of stress. If you have a hypersensitive stress response, it's easy to get pushed way beyond where we're comfortable. And so we have to be really careful about dosing that, really careful about thinking about how do we do that in a way that doesn't set a young person off. And so some of the ways that I like to think about that is to make it normal to have resets, right? Make it normal for a young person to say, I need a timeout, or I need a little reset. I need that I need some space. I need the opportunity to start over. Right? And so letting kids call their own timeouts, for example, can be incredibly powerful, right? Or using some kind of some kind of ritual, right? Using a focus ritual for more than just a high pressure, or in the case of sport, sort of game specific situation. Right? I think of the ultimate focus ritual as what everybody does when they get on the foul line in basketball, right? Every time you've ever seen or been a person on the foul line, you know that you have a very specific way of spinning the ball, and you touch it 3 times with your left hand, you dribble it 3 times with your right hand, whatever that thing is, you do it over and over and over again. And that's meant to help you get focused and drown out the noise. Those kinds of focus rituals are needed for young people who have an overactive stress response, not just in games, right? They may need them all the time, right? So now it's time to focus. We need some focus ritual. We need something that we always do that helps us get ready to pay attention. And then also thinking about individual challenges, right? Thinking about how, while this is harder, there is not just one goal for the whole team, right? We can be working towards some team goals, but we also want to make sure that there are benchmarks for individuals, and that we give some young people the opportunity to control how engaged they are in that. And one of my favorite strategies for this is the idea of talking to kids and making it normal for them to decide which gear they're going to be in, right? If we're doing some sort of physical activity, or if we're engaged in some kind of new skill building activity, and the kid starts to feel a little bit overwhelmed, then they can downshift into first gear. But a kid who's really feeling it and wants to keep going can shift up into second or third gear, right? But asking young people to pick their gear, and then encouraging them to move up as they go, or encouraging them to come back if they get overwhelmed, helps us manage a group of people who have different needs while all being there together. So thinking about, how do we offer these individual challenges? How do we create some opportunities for heterogeneous instruction, even though we often as adults have multiple kids at the same time? And obviously that makes it more challenging. So those are some of the sort of ways I like to think about how to set goals for young people who've been exposed to overwhelming stress, given what we know is different about them. And then the last one is to change our interventions, right? Make your behavioral interventions skill building and resilience building, right? And protect young people. Right. Normalize that everyone becomes dysregulated and needs strategies to get regulated. Some get dysregulated in regular situations, some in high stress situations, but sort of making it normal that everybody's going to have a moment where they need to move their bodies or do something patterned, repetitive, rhythmic, takes away the stigma of sort of a reset or punishment. Right? It makes a timeout not a timeout. It makes a place where you go to work on a skill, but you can also engage in that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity. And you choose to go there when you're feeling dysregulated. And if you're a really great youth worker, you choose to send yourself there sometimes, so that young people see you go there, go into the zone, or go wherever you need to get that reset, in addition to making the whole team go to the zone, or making individual young people go to the zone when they need that reset. But it's sort of normal. It's like, oh, we're going to have a better afternoon if we get a reset in. We're going to have a better afternoon if we engage in some patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity. And last and most importantly is this idea that a dysregulated adult can't regulate a dysregulated child. Right? And so if for any of this to work, for any of these healing-centered environments to be activated, we have to take care of the adults, right? Because a dysregulated adult can't regulate a dysregulated child. And the adults are going to be more dysregulated than ever too. And so how are we offering support? How are we giving them real, meaningful ways to get regulated themselves, to model that regulation and to be connected, to engage in patterned repetitive rhythmic activity, and to also engage in some resilience building stress themselves. All right, so, oh, it's exactly 3 o'clock. Look what I did. How long does it take to build a trusting relationship? What's the minimum time? There is no minimum. It's such a great question. I wish there was one answer, but it depends on the young person. The author name, Bruce Perry. I can do that one quick. Dr. Bruce Perry, he wrote a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. His new book is called What Happened to You. Both are incredibly well worth your time. Ooh, can I talk more about the term grit? If I had 6 hours, I absolutely would. People tell you students need more grit, but I believe that's missing the mark. So do I, Grace Kelly. I think the term grit and the way in which Angela Duckworth coined the term and had really specific research around the term gets sort of, I don't know what the right word is, but sort of gets misunderstood and misapplied in the way that it is. Resilience is absolutely more important than grit, in my opinion. And they're related. But I think that one of the problems that happens with grit is that it can often be, people feel like they're judged if they don't have it. Like you can choose to get yourself more gritty. And there are certainly ways in which you can practice, but it depends on so many things. And for young people who've been exposed to trauma, it's much harder for them to develop that in some cases. Virtual learning, balance between screen on, It's so hard. This is exactly the challenge of right now, this virtual learning and the balance between screen on and off time. Resilience absolutely has a community component too. Sorry, I got distracted by that. But I think this idea of on-screen time and off-screen time is exactly the challenge of now. The good news that I'll say is that while we know that the interactions that you have on screen are not the same as in person, they do still get some of those bursts of protective chemicals. And so they really are important to make sure that they help, right? And I think people who are delivering support programs through virtual learning often get discouraged and feel like they're not helping, but those moments actually do help in the same sort of dosing way, maybe not as strongly, but in the same dosing way. Those small interactions can count a lot. I am recognizing that it's 3:03, so please, if you, I hate to keep people after, but I will answer a few more questions if you want to stay. If not, thank you so much. Leslie, is there anything you need to say before we send people on their way?
Just that this is being recorded. I will be emailing a copy of the recording. There's a link to the recording to everyone. So if you do have to hop off, if you can stay, like Megan said, she's going to answer a couple more questions. It looks like somebody wanted to hear the author's last name again. It was a little hard to hear.
Oh, Perry, Perry, Bruce Perry.
Yeah, Bruce Perry.
Yep. Sorry. And then I'd love to learn more about resiliency and what you mentioned about misconceptions surrounding it. Yes, it is one of the most, I think it's one of those terms that just gets thrown around a lot these days. And I think it's really, from a neurobiological perspective, it has a very specific function. And I think thinking about that, the way that we dose stress, the way that we turn the stress dial just up a little bit, and then allow young people to come all the way back down to baseline is a really important part of the stress. What happens for young people is that they get a little bit of stress, and then before they get down to baseline, they get some more. And this unpredictable stress happens. And then all of a sudden, their baseline actually changes. They start to raise their baseline. That's what's called a sensitized stress response. And that's the kids who are overreactive. That's the kids who are behaviorally challenged, often in environments that don't understand that, because they haven't been able to come all the way back to baseline from and recover from the experience of stress, right? Stress happens, our bodies deal with it. And if we don't sort of release all that stress before we move on to the next stressful thing, we start to change the patterns of stress response in our brain. And so one of the things that I think we often forget is the idea of coming back down from stress, right? So we give young people the opportunity to stretch themselves, to go outside their comfort zone, to learn something new, and we don't come all the way back down. And that's part of making sure we have these normal, manageable patterns of stress. And so for kids whose stress responses don't allow them to naturally do that, the more we can give them opportunities to do it, the better. I think of it from a sport perspective, because that's how I spend most of my time. It's making sure you have a cool down at the end, right? Making sure you have the opportunity to really bring your body back down. And the more times you do that, the better you'll start to have those patterns happen. One of my favorite relationship building activities, my goodness. To be honest, I think there's so much value in the idea of having some kind of team circle at the end of whatever activity you have, and passing over control, letting young people run it, letting young people talk about what they want to talk about. Not a chance for you to like lecture one more thing into their day, but for them to talk about what they want to talk about, and you to sit there and listen and contribute when it makes sense. But I think that's a really important. I think that's my most effective, most favorite way of building relationships, is for young people to see that you care what they have to say. 8 minutes to reduce cortisol. What are the numbers for kids? Oh, such a good question. And 8 minutes for adults is best case scenario, right? So that's for somebody who has a regulated stress response. The chemicals involved in how your stress response engages depend on how severe your reaction is. So for young people who have really sensitized stress responses, there's more chemicals, there's more need to come down off of it. But I think even just knowing that it's at minimum 8 minutes for a adult means we are not giving young people enough time to recover from it, just generally. And the idea that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity helps us come down, right? Because when we engage in that, we're engaging the chemicals that help us manage the cortisol. So if we're patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity, releases the right kind of chemicals to help us get regulated and manage that. And so often our behavioral interactions with young people are to separate them, say, go sit quietly, when in fact the cortisol makes them need to move. What they biologically need is to move. And so sort of timeouts are the most biologically disrespectful way to get a young person to calm down. Well, maybe the most biologically disrespectful way is to tell them to calm down, because never in the history of calming down did anyone ever calm down by being told to calm down. But timeouts are right along there with them, right along, because once your stress response gets elevated, what your brain needs is to get regulated. And how you get regulated is patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity. So walking, running, jogging, riding a stationary bike, rolling on a foam roller, playing catch is incredibly regulating, because it's also attuning. You also have another adult or another person that you're attuned to. So those are actually the more effective behavioral strategies than sort of isolation, which is what we often do, and sort of keeping somebody contained. All right, I think I did the questions, and I only went 9 minutes over, which is like probably some sort of record for me.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah. Was there anything else in the chat that I missed that was particularly important?
I think that was it. If anybody else had a last question, they're trying to type furiously. If you want to raise your hand instead, I can probably take you off of mute if it's easier for you to just say your question. Let's give everybody a second to, if you want to raise your hand. Not seeing anybody raise their hands. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, then I feel like I packed those answers in, and one of my favorite things that Dr. Perry says about the brain, because he's the real brain expert, is that the answer to every question about the brain is, well, it's a little more complicated than that. And the answer to every question that you all asked was, it's a little more complicated than that, because the brain is a little more complicated, but generally, we know some things that really help us make some more intentional decisions about how we support young people.
Thank you so much, Megan. Yes, and yes, we will be sending a copy of the presentation, as well as the handout you mentioned.
Yes, I'll send a handout and I'll send a PDF of the deck too, if that's helpful.
Yep, yep. If you, I will send that out to everybody who registered.
Wonderful.
So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. It was great to be with everybody.
So just to close out, this webinar is part of our Voices of Summer webinar series. So look out for more to come in this series heading into summer. Our next webinar will be on called Engaged, using summer to connect with students and families. So we're going to talk about attendance and recruitment, retention with programs, and that will be on May 26th. If you're not following us already on social media, please be sure to do that. That's the best way to hear about announcements about new events, new resources, things like that. You can also sign up for our newsletter on our website. There you can also join special cohorts of peers interested in topics like sports, literacy, or youth employment. You can also find out about our consultation support and technical assistance for your summer program. And thank you again for everybody for sticking around for a few extra minutes. I hope you found today's webinar informative, and we will be in touch. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.